Well, do the New Testament authors take the Old Testament scripture out of context? Let's talk about this. Stay tuned. Well, in order to answer this question, let's take a look at two different prophecies, specifically in Matthew chapter 2. Now, of course, before we look at these prophecies, let's set the context. The birth of Jesus rattled Herod the Great. Way back in Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, we read, "When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him." You see, Herod had been given the title King of the Jews by the Roman Senate, so he had to govern Judea on behalf of the Romans. So when the Magi asked him in chapter 2, "Where is the King of the Jews? For we want to find him." Well, to Herod, that was just a complete insult. That title belonged to him and him alone. Therefore, this Christ child was now a threat to his throne. And what Herod does next is absolutely hard to comprehend. Look at verse 16. "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all of that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men." Historians tell us that this kind of merciless brutality was not really uncommon in Herod's reign. He was a power-hungry individual, paranoid. He was so jealous over his kingship that he actually murdered quite a few of his family members over it. Just total Game of Thrones stuff. He killed his wife, he killed his mother-in-law, he killed his brother-in-law, his uncle, and 3 of his own sons in fits of paranoia because he thought that they were attempting to steal his throne. Caesar Augustus was the first Caesar. He once said about Herod, "It is safer to be Herod's pig than his own son." Now, it's difficult to say how many of the young ones that Herod had killed. Commentators suggest that it could have been a dozen or so. Some say even up to 40 because Herod gave orders to kill all of the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity. But whether it was 12 or 40 or somewhere in between, killing one baby's bad enough. And just think about it. So for Joseph and Mary, this must have been the worst day of their lives. The king of Judea wanted their child dead, and he would stop at nothing to make sure that actually happened. So the answer, of course, would be for them, get out of Dodge. And they didn't even wait till morning. In urgency and desperation, they left under the cover of night, the text says. Look at verse 14. "And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt." So after they traveled out of town to Egypt, they would have eventually heard about Herod's bloody massacre. And just think about the peculiar guilt they must have felt. Because of the fact that Herod hated their little boy, all the babies in Bethlehem died. Just how many of those families did they know? How many of those babies did Mary in fact hold? How many of those toddlers did Joseph see playing outside? How many reoccurring nightmares did each of them have as they pictured the little faces of those little children that perished? Now, of course, it wasn't their fault. They weren't to blame at all. But just imagine the strange guilt that probably accompanied them. Joseph and Mary were likely thinking to themselves that the birth of this Messiah child would bring life to people. But instead of life, it was bringing death. Look at verse 14 again. "And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt." And then verse 15. "And remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" So here we come to the first of our two prophecies. We're going to be here for a little bit. "Out of Egypt I called my son." Now, it's important to recognize, firstly, that Christianity does not claim to be an entirely new religion founded 2,000 years ago, but it claims to be the fulfillment of the revelation that God had already given. So Christians, we read the Old Testament right along with the New Testament because they are a part of one grand storyline. So it's a bit like watching the Hobbit movies. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but you get a taste of the future. You're introduced to this ring of power, but you don't really know just how important it is to the entire storyline. You catch a glimpse of how it begins to eat away at Bilbo, but you don't really understand its real significance until you watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Well, the Jews understood some elements of the Messiah from the Old Testament. They knew a bit, but the rest of it wouldn't be filled out for them until Jesus actually came. So what we see in verses 14 through 23 is prophecy fulfilled. Now we need to remember that our author, Matthew, he goes to great pains to help his readers see that the Messiah of the Old Testament looks like Jesus. So contrary to any doubts that people may have, everything about Jesus, everything from his birth right through to his death and his resurrection, it fits perfectly in line with what the Old Testament teaches about the Messiah. So Jesus is the perfect mold. So let's take a look at this prophecy, out of Egypt I called my son, and discover one of the ways in which Matthew is painting that Jesus is the Messiah. So he's saying that Jesus' exit from Egypt was fulfilled in the prophet's words, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, the passage that's quoted here is Hosea 11:1. But when Hosea wrote this text down, he wasn't referring to some event in the future, but he was referring to an event that took place in Israel's past. So we understand that. Any scholarship will tell you that. He's referring to the way that the infant nation of Israel spent its earliest years enslaved in Egypt, and then God led them out of Egypt in the Exodus. Out of Egypt, God called his son Israel. Israel, of course, being his son. So many of us Bible students, we become a bit troubled or bothered by how Matthew uses this text, because it almost seems as if he's taking this Old Testament text out of context, which we're told never to take texts out of context. So what gives Matthew the right to handle this text in the way he does? How is this Jesus' exit from Egypt a fulfillment of this particular passage in Hosea? Well, to answer this, let me share just a couple of helpful thoughts in relation to prophecy and fulfillment. So we often think of prophecy as being nothing more than sentences that predict what will actually take place in the future. And we are correct. That is one kind of prophecy that the Bible speaks about. In Micah 5:2, for example, Micah predicts that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. You remember the text, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." So understand, this is a predictive prophecy that was fulfilled in Jesus' birth. But there are other kinds of prophecy. Another prophecy that presents itself throughout the scriptures is what you might call a pattern. So it's not a prediction that is being fulfilled, but it is a pattern being filled out. I heard it explained this way one time. So imagine you see a painting in an art gallery. So sometimes, if you're familiar with it, near the painting is a sketchbook. And when you look at the sketchbook, what you recognize is that the artist didn't just kind of throw paint on a canvas and go at it. But the artist took his time. They actually sat down and worked out what he or she was going to do ahead of time. The sketchbook is the evidence of that. So it's as if Matthew is saying, look, there is a sketchbook. And the sketchbook is what we would call the Old Testament scriptures. And these scriptures were written centuries before. And all of the sketches are there. And Matthew says, I am presenting to you the final portrait in color, completely finished, of what the Messiah looks like. And the Messiah looks like Jesus. So let me give you an example of a pattern being filled out in the scriptures. The epistle to the Hebrews, for example, argues that the entire sacrificial system in the Old Testament had built-in clues that made the entire sacrificial system look forward to the greatest sacrifice of all. So understand, the sketchbook was the entire sacrificial system. The final portrait was Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. And a similar kind of pattern prophecy is being filled out in our passage this morning. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, to understand this text, we need to have a good understanding of how many times the Scripture compares Jesus Christ with Israel. Jesus is often presented in Scripture as the better Israel, the true and perfect Israel, the Israel that does not fail. For example, it's recorded in Isaiah 5 that Israel's like a vine that produces disgusting fruit. But then you come to John 15. Jesus is the true vine that produces good fruit. Israel wandered in the desert for nearly 40 years in disobedience to the Father, and Jesus was tempted in the wilderness for 40 days, but he was perfectly obedient to the Father. So as we examine this prophecy that we come to here, out of Egypt I called my son, Jesus is the infant Son of God, and he comes to reenact this exodus from Egypt in his own personal history and experience the suffering of his people. So according to Matthew, Hosea's text is fulfilled in a new way in Jesus. So Israel, the infant Son of God, and its exit from Egypt was the sketchbook. And Jesus, the infant Son of God, and his exit from Egypt was the final portrait. So I do not believe that the New Testament authors were taking anything out of context. You have to discern whether the text is simply a predictive prophecy or if it's a pattern being filled out. Now, I know this was a bit more complicated. You might have to watch the video a couple different times to really take in its significance and understand it. But Lord willing, I was able to help you paint some kind of picture of how these New Testament authors at times quoted the Old Testament text. Well, thank you so much. God bless you the way.